Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Yo, 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 it's Jackie McDonald.
And it's me, Diana. Hello.
Well, everybody, we are all here gathered around the old table. We got a fire going here at the inn, and
We got teas.
teas.
As we stare at the snowy outdoors.
Snowy outdoors.
JK.
Reminds me of a time when there was a ghost in these there hills.
Speaking of a ghost, one time Rob told a ghost story and terrified like 20 children for weeks. They still talk about it, and it's been over a year.
Oh, but they had fun playing through the ghost's story. But this isn't a ghost story or even a storytelling podcast. This is the podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and discuss relevant research articles. And even though our podcast is not about telling stories, perhaps it should be. And that's what brings us to this week's topic, which is, in fact, storytelling. I don't know if anyone has segues. Let's all continue to the story.
I know, I like this. I really like this topic. At first, I'm not going to lie, I was like, ugh, what are we going to talk about with storytelling? But then I read these articles and I am A1 jazzed.
Oh, good.
A1 jazzed about this
That's pretty jazzed.
theoretical discussion that we're going to have today
Oh, good.
with no methods.
No.
We-
Just think piece after
I thought you were going
think
to say
piece
no
after
notes.
think
Yeah.
I
piece.
was like, oh.
No, we all have notes. But remember we used to do the podcast with no notes?
Yeah, I know.
That's,
It'd be like bulleted list. Like I found some
I
of
know
my-
we got-
you used to. I know
I
you
found
used
an
to.
app that had all my notes from like episode 80 something, and it just was like occasional notes. And then sometimes I'll read an article and be like, I'm so sure I have notes on that, and I'll go back and I'll find it, and it's like maybe a block of text, and I'm like, how did I record anything intelligent
Right?
whatsoever?
I never even took notes, ever.
Jeez.
You're like, you should take notes. I'm like, why? I'm like so smart, but it does help.
Paradoxical. It's paradoxical. You think we'd be doing less notes? Like we've been doing this for so
Right?
long. Like whatever. I
know.
read these articles like 5 minutes before. Like, give me the mic. I'm good for an hour. But no,
So-
we take more notes
Right.
now.
But, well, it could be. So Rob and I were kind of doing some guesstimation based on how many episodes we've had thus far and the fact that we're rounding up near 300. We do 3 to 4 usually articles per episode. So that means we've probably reviewed around 1,000 articles.
Wow. Thank you for doing
Yeah.
that.
Plus more than 10 books.
And a lot of books as well. So that may be one reason why notes are helpful.
I also never remember what we talk about when someone like comes up to me in real life and is like, oh my God, that episode. And I'm like,
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
I think we just, we have a lot happening. And they just more recently listened to it. I do feel bad when I'm like, I don't remember that anecdote that we talked about. But it is good that we include anecdotes, Rob, because those are the things people actually remember, right? They don't remember statistics.
Truth.
Yeah.
They remember anecdotes that tie back to the personal human experience. And that's why we should be including storytelling in our podcast as well as in our dissemination of our research.
Well, let me tell you a story about where this episode actually came from.
Okay.
Well, let me tell you all the story of where this episode came from. So this past fall at the Babbitt Conference, there was a really great talk by Bill Heward and Dr. Jill Dardig, and they were discussing a new book they were writing, which it's a reprint of an old book they wrote way back when, renamed now Let's Make a Contract, all about how to make a contract. And they spoke at length about how they came about editing and updating the book for sort of a modern audience. And they kept mentioning this article by Ronnie Dietrich, who we talked about at the Year in ABA as someone who'd passed away recently. And the article they were referencing is one of the ones we'll be talking about, all on the importance of storytelling. And they just kept coming back to that idea. And I think we've touched on it in a few episodes, on the idea of telling stories, on the idea of how nobody really, as much as we're like, got to take data, you got to share data. Nobody cares about data. If all you can show them is, look at this data, nobody cares. You have to tell a story with that data. And the book was written with these chapters. Like half of the book is like, here are the facts about behavioral contracts in the research. And half of the book is, here are just lots of stories about ways that contracts could be used. And it was just such an interesting talk, because it was all based on real research, but really told through story after story after story to sort of illuminate the key points. And as they're discussing it, it felt like a talk of like, oh, anyone could have gone to this talk. It didn't need to be like a conference for behavior analysts. Any human being could have just sat here and gotten a good amount of information. And after that, I grabbed that article, I downloaded that article, looked at it, and I said, we should just talk about this because I feel like we've danced around the idea of how do we disseminate, how do we share information, how do we make it meaningful when we're talking about behavior change. And realizing that so many of the techniques that are in storytelling, it's a lot of what we do here. I mean, I think that's one of the strengths of our show is that we have to take a lot of research articles around a theme, and we can't just be like, this is what is in this article. The method section said this. We really do have to
It's our horn.
tell a story about the topic. And I thought, let's dig into actually what makes good storytelling and look a little bit more into how we can use storytelling. And I'm glad that both of you are interested in talking about this and that we will be talking about this. And are talking about this.
It's happening now. Yeah, I'm excited.
Me too.
What are we reading?
Right now?
Well, in terms of articles.
For this podcast.
And then I know you wrote some starter questions
okay.
you wanted to bring us in with.
Okay, so yes, we have 3 articles to talk about today. They include Rethinking Dissemination, Storytelling as a Part of the Repertoire. That's by Dietrich and was published in Perspectives in Behavioral Science 2018. Also, An Emotional Appeal for the Development of Empirical Research on Narrative. That is by Critchfield and was also published in Perspectives on Behavior Science 2018. And finally, Narrative, Why It's Important and How It Works. And that is by Heinlein, and also published in Perspectives in Behavioral Science. The year was 2018. Somehow, even though these were all published in the same journal, they all look different.
They do all look different.
In the PDF format, so I don't know really what's going on there. But I sense a theme in those, and it's going to be good to hear what all these men had to say. What? Why are you looking at me?
Well, you started our notes off with the 4 starters. It seemed like you had a topic. I love that we have these notes that are like, here's what we're going to talk about in the article, the episode, and it's sort of like, yep. So anyway, episode, doing that now. We got to work on our storytelling about 300 episodes in.
Sorry. Well, the backstory is I just drove 2 hours back from Maine, and boy, are my arms tired. So I'm feeling a little out of sorts. I had some things I wanted to say about Rennie Dietrich, but I'll save that for Jackie's discussion. Okay. What I wanted us to talk about is something else that our listeners may not know is that Jackie and I are both English majors in college era times.
That's right.
Yeah. We were
double
both,
major. Boom.
Yep. Both of us were psychology majors, which is how we ended up in this field, but we were also both English majors because
I was a horrible English major. You were great, but I was really bad. I looked at all my stuff just recently and I was like, ooh.
Oh no.
That's why I went this way and not the other way.
Oh yeah. See, I was creative writing more so probably than I think what kind of like ended up steering me away from the English major route, like pursuing it at higher levels, was the lit crit side of it. I was like, I'm just not sure I'm like that on board with how one is supposed to interpret some of these works. But I do love a good story. And so I thought it might be kind of nice for us to potentially share like a novel that we like or a story that we find compelling and why. And then when I come back later and talk about Critchfield, we're going to be able to analyze what type of story it is that we like. Because we have some, he presents us with some standard characteristics of storytelling. So do you have one in mind?
I have one in mind, and this has stuck with me my whole life.
Okay.
So when I was 7, and I remember specifically being 7 in the summertime, I was 7.5, and I was very excited about being 7.5 in the summertime because my birthday's in November. And I was watching TV, and it was a black and white commercial. And it was a person that on one side, on the left-hand side of the screen, was a person brushing their teeth with the water on. And on the right-hand side, it was a lake with fish swimming. And as the water was draining out of the tooth, out of the faucet, the water was depleting on the other side until the fish died because there was no water left. And they did this like dichotomy multiple times with like washing dishes, washing your hands, brushing your teeth, and it was black and white too. So it wasn't like, oh, a real dead fish. Like, it was not graphic at all. The fish had like the crosses on their eyes to represent that they were dead. And then at the end of the commercial, it was like, don't leave your water running. Fish, preserve the fish and the waterways. And I think it was from the New York State Power Authority. That was which is weird that at 7.5, I remember who it did. And so even now, I never
wash your hands, brush your teeth.
No, I do. And when I wash my hands and brush my teeth, I always turn the water off. Like, I'll wash my hand, I'll like get my hands wet, turn the water off, get soap, scrub, then turn the water back on, and then turn it off. Same thing with my teeth, and same thing with washing my dishes. My husband and my mom get so mad. They're like, why don't you have a sink full? I'm like, no, I have to keep those fish alive. And I even told my kid about it. So this is a compelling story for me that has changed my behavior for my entire life.
That was a nice story to share.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you have one that you want to share, Rob?
A story?
I'm going to tell you guys about some novels that I like. That was kind of where I was heading with this.
Oh, I can tell you a novel too.
If you want. Okay.
My favorite novel of time, I have two.
Okay.
Is Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery.
Okay, great.
Now I'm trying to think. Now all I can think of are PSAs from the 80s that I
This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs.
Yeah, I don't remember if those had much impact on my behavior. I mean, novel wise, I am All Quiet on the Western Front is my favorite novel. I was very lucky Diana was able to get me for a nice present for my birthday a little while back, a first American edition of All Quiet on the Western Front, which is it's on my bookshelf now. But
I had to cut off all my hair and trade it in for that book. Yeah.
And unfortunately, I sold all our bookshelves so I could buy you some fancy combs, maybe.
That's so sad.
But that was a book that I think I remember both the storytelling of what occurred in the book as well as stories around discussions and where I was in my life when I was reading it. And so much of that book is really tied to personal reflections and personal activities. And I can still remember some of the discussions we had about it back in, I think it was sophomore year of high school. And it kind of was always very just impactful, just, both the messages of how horrible this war that's just so long. I mean, no one thinks about World War I anymore. It's sort of like the war. It's like, I don't know, it's boring, trenches maybe, and then that's all we ever say about it. But just really think about how much it decimated, the youth of Europe, and very little impact on America in that regard. But just how impactful that was, and thankfully that's not what.
What's the poem about the mustard gas? What's the last line of that?
Dulce et decorum est.
Yeah, that's World War I.
Yeah, yep.
And that's extremely powerful.
Oh, yeah, that also. Yeah, and we kind of read that around the same time. Yeah, that idea. But, sort of thinking about youth and thinking about growing up and thinking about being in these terrible situations and different contexts and how people don't understand even though they may have authority. And they did that a little bit. If anyone saw the Netflix version of All Quiet on the Western Front that came out and was a Best Picture nominee, it was not as good as the book by any means, but it did capture some of the idea of people in charge not necessarily having to deal with the outcomes of their actions and how, just other people sort of had to respond.
Okay. Well, hold that thought because later I want to ask you how you think that your favorite fits into some of these narrative structures. Okay. And then I have a hard time. I was like, can I narrow it down to what might be my favorite book? But I've always loved Henderson the Rain King by Saul Bellow. That is...
Never read it. I'll read it.
Okay, you can. I have a copy. That's excellent. And I love Cavalier and Clay, as Rob knows, by Michael Chabon. And then most recently, I read 2 books this year that I found extremely compelling, which were Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And then...
That was a very good book and super big and long.
I like them long. And then White Oleander by Janet Fitch. So I will return to those as well when it's my turn to talk again. Okay. Great. So we may all have different reasons why those stories were compelling to us, but I think chances are there are particular passages likely from them, right? That either The words were really stirring. The images that were created were really meaningful, and they likely contributed to some overall message or thematic components of that story that was meaningful to us at that point in our lives for some particular reason, right? So you don't end up remembering the whole thing, but you remember some important snippet or piece of it that kind of like, especially if you read it at a critical point in time. No one said Catcher in the Rye, but like lots of people.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I do love J.D. Salinger also. I can't pick them all. But you end up taking away some piece of that, right? That becomes the important part of that story. And this is true not just with fiction, it could be poetry, or it could be, like you said, Jackie, like some other means of storytelling, some other like anecdote that maybe kind of like fit into a larger narrative that stays with you over time. But just hearing stats about fish dying when you were 7.5 probably wouldn't have held the same meaning for you.
Not at all.
As the way in which they presented it. So that's why we want to be thinking about storytelling as behavior analysts in order to understand it, and then also think about how it might assist us in kind of getting our messages out there.
Yeah. So since all three of these articles came out in the same publication and the same issue and volume, we sort of organized them based on where they thematically went, I think, in terms of where we wanted our discussion of them to go. And since Ronnie Dietrich's article was the catalyst, well, I mean, Heward and Dardig were sort of the catalyst to talking about Dietrich. But since Dietrich is sort of the catalyst in our discussion, we're going to start there. And Jackie, you're going to take the lead on our discussion here. So
I am.
Let's discuss, shall we?
I can't wait. I love discussion articles.
Well, that's all we got today. So.
I know. But I did miss a good methods results discussion section, but that's okay.
We read a ton of books, and thinking about the books in an easy chair for one afternoon, here's what we wrote.
Okay. So Dietrich starts off this article by talking about the mission of behavior analysis, and Skinner posits that the mission of behavior analysis is better living through behaviorism, which I have never heard.
Well, it's usually chemistry. Is the expression, it's better living through chemistry.
I've never heard that one either. But so I'd never heard. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'm going to look it up and where it is later. They gave a reference, but I haven't looked it up yet. I haven't had time. But, so this is what our goal is for behavior analysis, but we have yet to have that happen, right? Because we haven't been quick to have the community at large adopt behavior analysis and approve behavior analysis as one of the mainstream psychological approaches, right? So this is what Dietrich says. And then he said, our science of influence has not been that influential. Whoops.
Oh, snap.
Yeah. So, sometimes we ask ourselves why, which we have in this podcast before, like, why isn't behavior analysis so why don't people like us as much as we like ourselves? And
that was a sad way to word that.
But it is true, right? And so
it's like the Simpsons episode where the Principal Skinner is going around trying to find where all the kids have run off to. And he's like, I've gone to the 4-H club. I've gone to the library and no one's there. Can it be that I'm out of touch? No, it is the children who are wrong.
Right. So some frequent ideas on why we might not have been adopted into mainstream psychology is potentially because we need to use more accessible language. If we've done that, then it might be more adopted. Or it could be how we're disseminating, right? So we're not doing the best job because I said that we're probably just disseminating to ourselves in a lot of ways, right?
Well, we love to publish in our own journals.
We do, right? And that's only one way of dissemination. Mm-hmm. And who reads our journals but us? Mm-hmm. And who goes to our conferences but us?
Just us.
Right? And so Dietrich suggests that there is a practical value of storytelling as a means of dissemination that might reach us to audience that are not just ourselves, right? So he defines dissemination as only achieved when the procedure has been adopted, right? So this helps when talking about all the efforts of dissemination and not just the topography-based, like the topography of publishing in our scientific journals, of presenting at our conferences. There should be more. We should be doing more in the dissemination efforts because we're just presenting to ourselves, right? So storytelling may be a valuable outlet to those that aren't listening to us at conferences or reading our publications. And he recommends like, oh, like teachers. He literally like is like teachers, lawyers, lobbyists, parents, educators. He could have
Anyone else?
he could have kept going. And so he also argues that if we as behavior analysts are going to tackle this feat of dissemination, we should start like we always start is figure out, okay, what is our target? How can we conceptualize it so that then we can forge ahead in our science? So he said that dissemination can be a class of operant responses that vary in topography, but they produce the same consequence, which is adoption, right? So that would hypothetically be the reinforcer, that people say, yes, I love this, and they adopt this process. So the function of storytelling then is to influence a listener to adopt a particular practice or policy. And Rob, you're going to talk a lot about this. And in order for behavior analysts to really understand the variables, there has to be a full account between the person that's disseminating and the person that's adopting. So both the listener and the speaker, and they might change roles later on. So our task, we have 2 tasks as behavior analysts, to identify the variables that may influence adoption and also the behaviors that have the greatest probability to contact reinforcers, meaning to contact that adoption. Yeah. So behavioral speaking, I like this. The speaker, who's the disseminator, is manding for adoption, even though there are many features of the tact present, right? Because it's not effective just to mand for something in the public. And they use a great example of, wouldn't it be funny if a politician got up and is like at the forefront and they're like, please vote for me, thank you. Right? That probably is not going to work. So they give an example. I think it would actually be awesome though. Like, I would like you to vote for me.
It was like the call for action
Period.
at the end of, your ad read, where it's sort of like, hey, if this company does this, and it makes you better, and now you should go to the website or subscribe to the app.
Yeah, but they started with that tact, right? Here are the problems. Tact, 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 tact. And here's how you can fix the problem. So that's how they kind of pulled around this storytelling. So I love that he suggests that many scientists are looking at the effects of dissemination, not only behavior analysts, but social scientists as well. Social scientists are calling it diffusion. And they characterize dissemination as a social process that helps us to improve the efforts of dissemination. So when I was reading this, I was like, oh, I wish Dietrich would have talked about the social episode here, what Skinner talks about when it's an interaction between 2 or more people, when there is a interplay between that listener and the speaker. If you're interested in reading about that, it is in Science of Human Behavior.
Look it up.
AKA 1954 or something like that. But it's good. So storytelling will only be effective if the speaker knows the values, history, and the variables and the experience of the listeners, right? Because I could tell you a story and you'd be like, we've all been there. And if it doesn't connect with my values, my past reinforcers, any of my experiences, I'll be like, thank you, and move on, right? So it will not be adopt. So Dietrich argues that many scientists do not know how to engage in dissemination apart from articles and presentations. We don't know how to talk to lobbyists or policymakers or educators.
We just did a whole episode
parents.
about that.
Right, I know. And so storytelling is really about how we can talk to those people. And it's nice to conceptualize it as the end product of a decision-making process. So he makes a really great point that not everyone is affected by data in the same way, which we all know, right? Because I can show a graph to my mom. I'm like, Mom, look at this graph. And then her eyes gloss over.
And that's even assuming that the person who's telling the story about the graph has not manipulated the graph or manipulated the data in a way where it is still accurate, but their representation has changed the story they're now trying to tell with the graph. Again, we did the whole Calling Bullshit book club that should have just come out on the free feed recently, of all the ways you can do that, even without meaning to, which can, mess up your story. Right.
So Dietrich wants to talk about storytelling and that decision-making as choice-making, right? We have a lot of options. And he talks about the matching law here. He talks about concurrent chains. And he says, there's going to be biased and unbiased choices. Unbiased are going to just look at the data. Biased choices may include a lot of emotions and other external variables that may play a part in making decisions. And the advertising company definitely appeals with emotions, as evidenced by my fish in the water, right? And they also bring up don't mess with Texas advertisement. Who was talking about that recently? You weren't with me?
I don't think so.
The Don't Mess with Texas campaign is where they had a prominent musical person that would sing a song and be like, you need to pick up your litter.
Yeah.
Don't mess with Texas.
I lived in Texas then.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well,
It was big.
it was huge, and litter was reduced by 72% due to this appeal to cultural variables. And I love that he was like, it wouldn't act the same if you're like, don't mess with Rhode Island.
No.
I laughed so hard.
It might have been if it's like, this trash is getting in your coffee milk. Like, oh man, Rhode Island's mad now.
No.
This trash is covering up
100% no more litter.
the potholes in your in your road. And so Dietrich suggests that Catherine Maurice, the author of Let Me Hear Your Voice, was one of the greatest storytellers of our field, and that she reached a greater audience because she appealed to those cultural and emotional variables that scientists had not yet to that point, right? So Roger suggests
It's like a good read.
It's a
if
great
you
read.
haven't read the book.
yeah, it is a good read.
Yeah. It's a well-told story.
And Roger said that there's steps to adoption to solve a problem. So the first one is solve an important problem for a client. 2, that whatever you're trying to impart has a relative advantage over current practices. 3, the person in charge has to be seen as credible. And 4, it has to be compatible with the existing cultural values and attitudes of the intended audience. And Maurice did all of that, right? Catherine Maurice was credible because she was a mom. There was a problem. Her kids weren't getting services. They weren't speaking. There was an exanted over the current practice because there was no current practice at the time. And it was compatible with those existing cultural variables. So behavior analysts have to first, whenever we're going to do some dissemination, figure out who our target audience is. And then we need to figure out who's in charge of the money, right? So a lot of the times that's policymakers. So we need to make sure that we know our target audience. Then we have to influence policymakers, which will then give us money to fund those things. And an example that they used was the 30 million words campaign that we talked about in the Hart and Risley book way back in an episode far away.
I'll remind you later.
Thank you.
Yep.
And even here, we have to tell different stories to parents versus to lawmakers versus to educators, right? So that can't be one single story. How we weave those variables has to be different. So we really need to think about who our audience is and identify the specific cultural norms and values that would influence our audience. And what does the culture define as a problem? And then we have to move from there. We have to, as the disseminator, move from speaker to listener to speaker to listener to make sure that the problem that we think is a problem is actually a problem. And so they said, scientists may not be the best disseminators. We should probably take more classes in storytelling. And then they gave an example of a biologist who was tenured and decided to leave his job, quit his job, and go back to film school so that he could make films about the threats of climate change. And that was a better dissemination tactic for him than publishing and going to conferences. And then he just has a ploy to ask us to read Heinlein's article and use it to our advantage. And Rob's going to talk about Heinlein's article, so I'm not going to
let's
spoil you.
Well, why don't we take a little break now that we have a little introduction as to what we'll be talking about in the rest of the episode. And then when we come back, we'll hit a little bit more of the details about what goes into narrative that may make it so compelling, and then some more directed dissemination and storytelling targets we could look forward to in using in the future or taking part in the future. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about storytelling. But before we continue our conversation, I want to remind all of our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. And by listening to this episode, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your podcast player kind of notes section to go directly to the page and put in some key information, including 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one now. It's front, F-R-O-N-T. It's not the back. It's the front.
I figured out now why that's the code word.
I didn't write that code word. Who wrote that code word? Did I write that code word?
I didn't write that
Weeks
code
and
word.
weeks ago and totally forgot
Yeah,
about it?
I think
Oh,
so.
yeah, because
Okay.
I did not.
I have absolutely no idea why I wrote that
All
code word.
quiet on the.
Oh, okay. Great. I don't think I wrote that code word, though. I'm freaking out now. It was the ghost we heard earlier in our recording.
He was like, I want to be part of this, so here's a secret code word.
Ooh. We're telling the most boring story about code words. Front. All right. Since every other article that we'll be discussing refers to Heinlein and says, you've got to read Heinlein. Let's talk about Heinlein, shall we?
Like, if you were Heinlein and you were reading these, you're like, man, I did a great job.
Right?
Right.
And, Heinlein's article here does something that I love. And it also does something that I am less interested in. And based on the amount of time we have per episode, I'm probably going to cover the first half of this article in a decent amount of depth and then sort of gloss over the second half, as it is a lot longer than the other kind of think pieces here.
I think you just say this is beyond the scope of our current
I could,
discussion.
but I'd rather tell the story of I loved the first half of this, and then I felt like I lost the story that Heinlein was trying to tell a little bit, and I think there are contexts that it would be way fun to come back to and look at. But in terms of what we're discussing here, like what's up with stories, that first half I think is very strong. Disagree?
No.
So at the start, I think it does this great thing, which I love when thinkers in our field do, which is take something that feels like it's not really anything we'd want to talk about. In this case, why would I continue reading this book I'm reading? And go into what might be the behavior analytic underpinnings, the technology or the conceptual systemization of why am I still reading this, right? And I think this part gets to most of what we want to be discussing, which is how can stories be used to share information and share meaningful information. And so Heinlein starts sort of discussing the idea that very few people in the field have actually talked about why narrative, not necessarily stories, but narrative, which again is a part of any storytelling. And, reviews that Skinner had certainly talked about language and kind of the relationship that occurs in narrative. Certainly plenty of linguists have talked about what goes into stories in the sense of the format and, the formal structural relationships and grammar that goes into stories. And that, I'm sure, is very interesting. It's not exactly what we're interested in. But Skinner had mentioned, in terms of looking at what's up with stories, quote here, insofar as literature simply describes human behavior in narrative form, it cannot be said to show understanding at all, but the writer often seems to, quote, say something, end quote, about human behavior to interpret and analyze it, double end quote, there. And so this idea that, well, stories are stories, but it's not really clear like where all the kind of functional components go into it, why it would be of interest to us other than it's describing events that happen in our actual lives. But Heinlein really felt that narrative and storytelling deserve a better understanding as to how is it a component of human behavior in general, and how is it relevant and socially significant to us, therefore deserving of more study. He mentions that stories tend to be very addictive. They tend to be much more convincing than a lot of other forms of narrative. We've talked about data being possibly not as convincing as we might want it to be. that opinions can be changed through stories, usually with some amount of factual information, but almost always starting with some sort of narrative illustration of what the problem is. That humanity throughout history has used narrative to describe history, to describe religion, to describe human practices like child rearing. It makes sense of a lot of things in our lives. We were listening, I think, Diana, I can't remember if you mentioned it off before we started recording, but we just got back from a long drive and we were listening to a Freakonomics with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who was asked, why do you read so many fiction stories when your job is more of a kind of a nonfiction job? And he just really spoke very eloquently about the power of stories in changing the way we think about things and in creating an empathy. And Heinlein talks about this as well, the idea of how do we get into someone else's shoes other than reading a story about them. I certainly think about things like stories from the TV show The Wire. It's not a narrative in the same sense as a book, like we're kind of talking about, but the idea of people in cities and people in these interlocking societal structures struggling, even though very few of the characters on that show would be said to be like, that's the evil bad guy. You know, there are a few folks, but most of them are individuals who are just locked into these systems. And I think that as a piece really impacted my willingness to think about other people as individuals with different problems, and that my idea of what is right and wrong is not enough to change how other people behave, and in many cases is not appropriate for talking about how other people could behave because I'm not in those contexts. So you really can do a lot with that empathy using stories and narrative. Heinlein as well talks about that. And Skinner even had another quote here. Instead of reporting to the listener something which he alone sees, he gets the listener to see something his way. So we know that narrative can really have this important component. It's one of the most, this is a quote from a Konnikova piece, one of the most powerful forms of persuasion available to us, especially stories that fit in with our view of what the world should be like. Facts can be contested. Stories are much trickier.
It's true. I was also thinking when I was reading this that he didn't bring up, I don't remember, is that stories are a way that we pass down our cultural variables as well. And that's something he didn't bring up.
No, right? not directly.
Right, but wouldn't that be an interesting, I guess, addition to storytelling is how storytelling kind of is the thread of our cultural life, right? Like we talk about our families that way. We don't talk about data, right? We're not like 4/5 of our family immigrated to the United States, right? But it's a story about the travel and how we felt, and I thought that would be interesting. And I was surprised that they didn't talk about it.
I mean, it's in the opening in terms of the idea of how religion and child rearing practice. So it's kind of mentioned, but it doesn't get into the nitty gritty. I think
that would be cool.
He gets more into the weeds of more like a book, in this paper.
Right. But that would be a fun. Critchfield does a little bit of it too.
Only briefly at the beginning, but he does reference that people talk about the importance of passing down cultural.
So if we have to make another
mores.
If we have to make another one of these thought pieces, let's do that.
Oh, okay.
Sounds great. And I would say that this piece even convinced me a little bit about maybe something that I'd like to learn more about, which looking at stories and looking at how they can sort of change our perspective. This piece started to make me think if I really want to understand narrative, I might need to look more into relational frames. Oh, no.
You just love it. You're on your way there.
I
so
know.
I don't know if you do.
Relational frames wonk in a couple years.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily do. I think you can explain it without relational frames, but I can see how he would say that, but I don't think you need to.
Yeah. Well, in any case, what are some of the principles that could account for how powerful narrative can be? And again, I think the first half of this article really looks at it in terms of this very microcosm of what's in a story. What are the components in a story? Where are the EOs? Where are the reinforcers? Where are the SDs? And then the second half does seem to get a little bit more into why would humans find stories and storytelling and textual behavior reinforcing at all, which is interesting in its own right, but I think goes a little bigger picture than what we're looking for right now. So I'm going to just gloss over that a little bit. But
that makes sense. I agree with you.
We'll talk a little bit more about sort of the first half of the article. So there are these really neat diagrams, which did require a second read over because they're a little confusing and they're not like kind of our typical diagrams necessarily. But the idea is that we could think about stories as these relational networks, which are units of sentences and paragraphs. And we get reinforcement from how these different networks can transform a lot of different psychological functions related to, the different relations that we see in our story. So, for example, something like a cliffhanger would be a relation you can look at. It's an establishing stimuli. There's a question raised, which creates a reinforcing effect of whatever we read next, is going to have some sort of reinforcing effect because it will answer that question, or at least lead us to gather more information about a question that we are interested in answering. So they have all these. So Heinlein has all these diagrams of what might be in the story. So you've certainly got different SDs when you're reading a story where you have sort of cue that everything, all the responses within, so sort of the beginning of your paragraph or the beginning of your book, all the responses within will have some sort of a consequence. It could be extinction to, reading this part, or intermittent reinforcement about this plot line. But there's some amount of repeatedly reinforced responses. So by your continued reading of whatever the story is, I assume listening would be relatively similar. You're going to sort of have these either basic contingencies in that, they're words that either have some sort of emotional valence to you, or that the reinforcing event is some sort of a change in a situation. So it's sort of this behavioral chain of reading where there are questions being asked in the story, which create EOs that play into continuing to read, and then certain answers will come out, which are reinforcing to the original question. There may be other components which are sort of questions that are answered very quickly, that are sort of that intermittent reinforcement. So maybe a subplot or a character comes in, that's sort of for humorous effect. But all of these would continue to sort of reinforce your, your textual behavior. You can do your textual behavior. We certainly could have a kind of the longer diagram. I'll kind of try to describe it without the picture necessarily. But you've sort of got, in most stories, some sort of initial situation where a story starts and promises a reinforcer. An example would be in kind of a listener story rather than a textual story. You wouldn't believe what happened yesterday, right? The sort of promise of information to come that will reinforce your continued listening or reading behavior. Throughout the narrative, we have additional questions that are raised that are either related to that original situation or could be independent to the situation. Some of the story answers some of those questions. So again, in a typical kind of here's the discriminative stimulus, here's your response, and then reinforcement in terms of getting that information, which kind of continues to maintain that reader-listener behavior. Certain establishing conditions will end as certain plots and parts of the story end and new ones begin or lead to other parts of the story. We think of those stories where it's I've solved the first of the puzzles, but there's more puzzles to be solved to get to the end of my quest to become the king or whatever it would be.
Some of them mystery stories. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. These are all mystery stories. Yeah.
So that kind of helps, I think, with this type of layout too, because there's burning questions to be answered within the plot. And that's what progresses the plot along.
And again, you've got different rates of reinforcement delivery in terms of, I mentioned a little bit already, but that you have lots of different plots happening. There's the one big plot. There's lots of subplots. There might be sort of humorous asides. And all of these will sort of create new establishing conditions and old establishing conditions until you come to the end when everything gets answered, everything is resolved, and you get all of the reinforcers delivered at the denouement of the story. If it's a good story. If it's a bad story, perhaps they leave a lot of questions open. So again,
doesn't mean it's a bad story.
Doesn't mean it's a bad story. No, because again, the reinforcement has come throughout your reading of the story and those various kind of establishing operations being presented. Now, that sort of gets at the crux of when you are telling a story, these are the components that you want to have in your story. You have to bring your listener in. You have to have information that they're interested in. I think that goes a little bit into what Dietrich was saying of there has to be some sort of a problem. It has to be phrased in a way that is of value to the listener or to the reader. And then you have to give information about whatever that initial question is, and then continue that pattern. And Heinlein brings it up, and then you brought it up again really nicely, Diana. I think mysteries are probably the easiest way to do this diagramming because those are it's a series of questions. Who did what? How did they do it? Why did they do it? You keep getting more information. Some of it's a red herring of, I think this person's the murderer, but they're not the murderer, and here's why they're not the murderer, but here's a relevant story related to why they're not the murderer, but why you'd think they're the murderer, and it goes on and on and on, and it can make for a very compelling read. And so that really gets into some of the components that go into stories. The next section, again, I'm just going to gloss over it really quickly, kind of gets a little bit more specifically into attending to behaviors of the listener, gets a little bit more into how reading and textual behavior might be, reinforced or have a transformation of function through the use of things like stimulus equivalents, through, again, relational frames. A key component here, I think, comes into the idea of how we can kind of transfer. We can use that idea of transfer when we talk about putting oneself in the place of another, where we're sort of looking at things like, imitation of other behavior in real life. And then that leads to some amount of silent reading, fusing listener and reader repertoires, in that we're reading about things that we could do in our lives, but it might be a different character who is doing it.
And that, again, sorry to interrupt you, but that's what Justin Trudeau was also talking about. It's just the value of experiencing some other world and some other experiences via a character in a book that you might not get in another format, and the development of empathy towards that person's experiences can be really strong in a book and in this type of narrative format. And his argument was if kids are just like watching these 30-second videos on TikTok, you're not getting that type of in-depth emotional experience that could teach you to be empathetic in other situations.
That's right.
Yeah. This also gets into the idea of
My
things like
boyfriend, Justin Trudeau.
He's so cute.
some things like, how does joint attention play into our interest in sort of sharing narrative or sharing stories with others, kind of initially with, our parents who might have read us stories. And so there's a lot that needs to be discussed, and it's not all going to get discussed in, the tail end of our episode here. But there are a lot of pieces that go into narrative that would be interesting to delve into more, to sort of talk about, hey, how could we use better narratives, or how could we better teach others to use effective narratives? It's going to be some combination of, the interplay of our textual behavior, tax occasioned by verbal behavior, transfer of response function, transfer of stimulus functions. You could look into equivalence or relational frames and how that plays into how we take narratives and then use that to change behavior in real life rather than just through stories. How does joint attention play into our acceptance or denial of certain stories or interest in stories? And then other pieces, he gets a little bit into things like reading comprehension and the Headsprout Company. And again, I think there's a lot we could be looking more into when it comes to narrative and stories. And he really only touches the tip of the iceberg. But this is a really fascinating article. I think one that if folks do start researching what is important about narrative as chains of behavior, I think this could definitely be one of those touch points that just keeps getting cited over and over and over again as like a really great think piece that has more and more layers the more you've read it. I read it twice. I did notes on it a little bit. I skimmed it again before this one. And I still see there's just so many different areas we could be looking into. So I hope that my touching on a few of the pieces I found most interesting is interesting enough storytelling that people might look it out on their own, because I bet they would get something a little different depending on what their interests are in studying human behavior. If they're more about some of the basic research or they're more about relational frames, I think you might get something different out of this article. And then certainly he does talk about how we can use storytelling, but in our field to disseminate, just like Dietrich did. But since I think Critchfield does the same thing and they cover a lot of the same ground, why don't we move into Critchfield, and then if anything else comes up that wasn't discussed in Critchfield, that was discussed in Heinlein, we can come back to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the overall takeaway from these articles is how much can we learn about the process of storytelling and what really are the compelling components of narrative such that it can then influence how we incorporate storytelling into our field. That's the general idea, but then all of these writers, or at least especially Heinlein and Critchfield, got so excited just thinking about storytelling and all the questions that they wanted to ask and answer that they then go off on different branches just in further discussion of what does it mean to do storytelling and what may be some of the important components. So both of them kind of do some sidewinding in their articles, which I appreciate because this is a really understudied area in our field. We don't have, when we chose these articles, we're like, what? No data? Mm-hmm. But that's because it's just people thinking about this, really. And there's not that much out there. So this is an area that we could study more, but you're going to be in the weeds with it. It's not easy research. It's in the weeds research.
It's one of those, you either, the story
It's
that they are
deep.
telling either compels you to say, I bet that is the underpinning of what's happening, or it doesn't. But there's no way to say, yes, this is definitively how stories are working or not working.
And a big part of that, too, is that everyone's personal experience and what you're bringing in when you're experiencing a story at any particular point in time is going to have a pretty heavy weight to your interpretation of the story, what the EOs are that are in flux at that particular moment in time, and whether it then therefore will compel you towards action. And that's going to be variable for each person. So it's going to be difficult to pin these pieces down. And Critchfield gets into that to some degree in his article. So he picks up pretty closely to where Heinlein was leaving off. I more pulled from some of the other sections of his writing so that we didn't completely overlap, Rob. But he does talk about why we tell stories, and it can be for entertainment purposes or persuasion purposes, or like you said, Jackie, to review the rules and pass those down about our cultures and society. Storytelling is, our oldest form of passing on information, and some people are really, really good at it, and some people are not as good at it. And it's a skill that can be built over time if you have an understanding of the components of it. So we probably want to study storytelling because it's important culturally. We value being a good storyteller in our society, so it would be a good behavior to study. And like we've said, it can help us as behavior analysts advance our science if people find those stories compelling, and it brings people to find hearing about behavior analysis more reinforcing. That's what we're really talking about here. So he offered us this quote: "Narrative is a process of manipulating MOs. What the listener learns early on makes it reinforcing to find out more later on." So just like Heinlein's diagram, listening to a story and continuing to read and interact with it builds upon itself such that it becomes more reinforcing over time. Critchfield says that the structure of a story can promote varying dependent variables, which is the behavior, and those are maintained by continuing the story. So we really want to be thinking about what is going to develop good attending or listening behavior so that we can keep people's attention. And strong plots can help produce this effect. So he gives us some common plot structures for us to kind of think about, and they're very simple. And it's awesome because he shows us these graphs that Kurt Vonnegut made. I don't know, it's suddenly like Vonnegut's here, and it's like little graphs, and their time is on the x-axis, and then the character's good fortune is on the y-axis. And so he's graphing the plot of these different types of stories on this little graph to show you like when the character is feeling good and feeling bad in the story. So he gives us 4 examples. They include Man in a Hole, which is when the character starts out good, something terrible happens, they're in a hole, and they have to get back to the good place by the end of the story. Bad to Worse, where something starts out bad and ends up worse.
It's like the movie Good Time. Remember Robert
Yeah.
Pattinson? He's trying to get money so he could get his brother out of jail. He's trying to break his brother out of jail, and it just Yep.
It
was a good time to watch, not a good time for Robert Pattinson's character.
Cinderella story where things
Like Caddyshack.
What?
I don't know.
I'm sorry. Is that what happened in
I don't know that
Caddyshack?
either.
No, that's a quote from Bill Murray's character in Caddyshack.
Oh, nope.
I know who that is.
Never
I do
mind.
too. I know who Bill Murray is. Winning.
That's Charlie Sheen.
I know who Bill Murray is.
Okay.
Okay, with Cinderella, the character starts out in a bad situation, temporarily gets something good happening to them, then loses it. And he says ultimately they end up better for the loss. And then finally, Rags to Riches is the last one that he kind of like adds in later. And that one everyone's familiar with too, right? Things start out bad and get good. So
Like
those are
Newsies.
yeah. I won't quote Newsies at this moment in time for everyone's benefit. Okay, so he says that the Vonnegut graphs for each of these also, when you ask a reader, then their emotional arc pretty much reflects the plot lines. So when the character is feeling good, the reader's feeling good. When the character's feeling bad, the reader is feeling bad. And these are tried and true, tested plot structures. So now I want us to think about the story that you told me about before to see if it maps onto one of these, just as an exercise for ourselves. So they were The Man in a Hole, Bad to Worse, Cinderella Story, Rags to Riches.
Tender as a Night is probably...
I haven't read it, so can you tell us?
No. I actually can't remember the storyline except that it is
Tender is the night.
is about it was supposed to be about F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife.
Then I would say that might be a bad to worse.
But I think the end is good. Rags to Riches would be Ella Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables, though, right?
Yeah.
Because she was an orphan, and then she doesn't become rich, but she becomes like beloved by
Rich
her
in
community.
love.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Colleen Dewhurst and the other guy.
that's right. I love Colleen Dewhurst. If I could be her, well, she's dead now.
She'd be
but
dead.
I would be dead.
I would be that. What about you, Rob?
What, All Quiet on the Western Front? That'd be bad to worse.
I thought you were going to make a man in a hole joke about the trench.
Oh, I mean, yeah, but then they don't really climb out of the hole. I mean, if you climb out of the hole, you just get shot, so it's bad to worse.
Bad to worse. Okay, very good. My stories, the stories that I like are flawed characters who find redemption through self-discovery. So I guess that is,
Man in a hole?
I don't know, maybe a Cinderella story, perhaps, right? So because you have to figure out, nah, I think that's wrong. Probably Man in a Hole. I guess Man in a Hole. Or Rags to Riches, perhaps. Emotional Rags to Riches might be the best. So most of those books that I described have that kind of plot. That book is about a morally corrupt character who goes on this, it's called a Bildungsroman, right? Which is a journey to find yourself. And he actually, then discovers more things about himself so that he can be a better person. And not so much the Cavalier and Clay. Theirs is maybe a Rags to Riches story.
I agree.
That one's just such a great writing, which I want to talk about in a second as well. And then what else did I talk about? Demon Copperhead. That one.
Bad to worse.
Bad to worse, but with an emotional redemption.
Yes, you're right.
Plot line too. So
It's bad to worse.
I
in a
really am
hole.
big on emotional redemption, I think is probably the key there. So, okay. So that was fun. I just wanted to make sure we talked about it. And, he says, you can ask people, of course, how do they feel? And now we're measuring emotion. And so we had a digression to try to decide how we're going to measure emotion, just like we do in many of the articles that we read. We agree with you, Tom Critchfield. There are ways that one can measure emotional responses, and it is important to justify measuring those because they tell us something important about ourselves and about reading. He talks about mean word valence and how we can map on emotional responding to varying words based on their valence. He did a little unpublished study with Derek Reed, like way long ago, where they looked at different words and how happy they made the person feel. They asked the person, and then how well they thought that the person who wrote the passage could teach the reader, and those were highly correlated. So using more what was viewed as positive words can also make someone more likely to continue reading and likely learn from that, supposedly, right? So that was kind of cool. He put in this table that was not his table. It was from Werner et al., but they categorized words as strongly unpleasant, neutral, and strongly pleasant. Words such as asphyxiation, torture, leukemia, racism, homicide. Those are all unpleasant words.
We don't need to read every word in this.
And then strongly pleasant, just so you hear some. Vacation, enjoyment, lovable, sunshine. And my favorite, of course, pizza.
I like lovable the best.
Oh, great. Good. So he says, it's not just the plot line, right? There are all these other pieces that we need to think about when we're thinking about storytelling. So the use of particular vocabulary, phrasing, the tension that's in the story, and the complexity of the prose all contribute toward our feeling that we're taking away from the story, right? From the narrative. And there is a visceral quality to nature that can override the semantics of how the piece is really put together. That you might see this a little bit more in fiction. A little bit more in poetry than in fiction, although some fiction kind of lacks the overall plot line that we had discussed before. He also noted famously plot-challenged films such as My Dinner with Andre, Lost in Translation, and Garden State. I was like, oh, I guess I like plot-challenged films because these really speak to me.
I love Garden State since I watched it.
Yes, so he says, you got to have highs and lows. Without the lows, you don't experience the highs. This relates to the tension in the story too. So we are working to interpret that for ourselves. We have to make sure that we are, mapping onto these types of tried and true plot structures in narrative. And that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. Well, since this is a kind of big thought piece episode, and we're not going to be able to say, and everyone, tomorrow when you go to work, here's how but there's some areas we can be thinking about. So let's move into dissemination station and discuss those a bit. So I think kind of the crux of our conversation and our review of this research today really stemmed around the idea that there are lots of directions I think we could go into in our review as a field of how to better use storytelling and narrative. It could be as simple as just trying to use it by thinking about your audience more closely, by trying to make examples that are relevant to the context and the history of your listener to be more persuasive. It could be more about looking at the nitty-gritty of what makes up a story when it comes to speaker-listener behavior, kind of textual transcriptive behavior, and sort of what are the underpinnings that are involved in making a good story. So, what's the magic formula? What are the ingredients to good story? As well as things, that could be more of that kind of grammatic or sort of the narrative structure, as well as the word choice that is being used. But some areas that we probably want to also be exploring is the impact of some of these stories. I'm going to go back a little bit to a list that Heinlein put out of if we had better understanding of stories, some sort of action steps. You could certainly use personal stories when introducing behavior analysis to others, maybe to a new client or to new students. He brings up a book written called Behavioral Science: Tales of Inspiration, Discovery, and Service, which he has found to be engaging for readers. But he also says maybe we could use some fictional stories to illustrate principles within the field, not necessarily to convince others, but to better explain concepts, not necessarily to avoid using the more scientific ways that we often teach, but to sort of bring in listeners to gain an interest. So maybe some social validity around what it is we are about to teach by using stories. We could share our accomplishments in more lightened up ways by sort of adding more information about how we came to decisions. Now, we've talked a lot about how we love part of the reason that we really enjoy having guests on the show is not so much that they just tell us about the research article that we totally could read and understand ourselves, but because we get more stories about how did they develop the research, what pitfalls occurred in the research, because I think that's much more illuminating in many ways than just like, I read your article and in your article you said this. Yes, that is what I said, right? That's fascinating in some ways, but not as much as those stories that go behind the article. However, Heinlein also cautions, if we just focus on storytelling only and don't share reproducible knowledge, it sort of misses the point. So this isn't about how do we just make more razzle-dazzle in presentations.
Razzle-dazzle.
It's about how do we make some razzle-dazzle to get everyone interested in, the meat. It's not just the sizzle. We got to have the steak too. And then also, could we use more stories to do kind of sense making around our field and presenting our field better in general? And he brings up, I think it's Carol Schneider's The Science of Consequences, which I immediately added to our Amazon possible book club list for the future, where there's a discussion.
It's a good book. I read it.
Have you read it? You've always read it. I feel like you've always, I'm like, what about this book? You're like, I read that already, which, we should just have we should have a Jackie month where we're like, what book do you already read, Jackie, to save you a couple steps? But looking at sort of the biological framework that led to so many behaviors, or the link of human behavior with biology, or could we use? You mentioned the Chomsky narrative as one that there's other stories about Chomsky that aren't. What a brilliant linguist he was, and man, he certainly showed that B.F. Skinner that verbal behavior was a dumb book to write. That there are a lot of other stories about Chomsky about him being controlling, him keeping the field back. This is not I'm not trying to diss on Chomsky. This is what was in the Heinlein article as some ideas. So, some areas that need to be looked at and some ways that we could be thinking about how we do our storytelling. And Diana, I know you wrote a question, or maybe it was something that you wanted to cue yourself of. What are some ways that we have seen this done well in our field? We mentioned, let me hear your voice in our discussion, but were there any other examples of folks you think are good storytelling? I mentioned Dardig and Heward is really, I got a copy of the Let's Make a Contract book.
I always want to sing
and it does have these just great narratives. And it's hard to read a book, I think, in the field that you're like, I felt like it was a nice review of information and I would give it to a parent. Usually and I like that book. I don't know how I would give this to a parent who wasn't also a behavior analyst, but that would be one that I would, because it is so many great stories that are so reflective of the content of the book.
Well, I know we haven't talked about Pat Fryman yet in this episode, but he is, I would say our greatest living storyteller in
I
our
agree.
field.
Yeah, he's so good.
And we're talking about him this summer.
Yeah, we are. With
That's
our book.
right, because we have a book to review of his. I also think that Wolf 78 social validity article, like he structures that as a story.
He's so cute too. He's got great blue eyes. If you ever want to look him up.
I know. I keep that picture of him in my slideshow.
Yep, I do too.
He starts that off with a conflict. He is conflicted, right? And he walks us through his thought process. And I remember that article because of the storytelling structure. And I feel like sometimes we look at that and we're like, oh, how quaint. Back in the 70s, we could tell stories. We should still be telling stories. That's what keeps people interested. Just hearing data is the most boring. I mean, I love data, but it is boring and dry. That's why everyone comes to hear Pat Fryman talk, is because he makes it compelling and he makes it personal and he makes you feel like you are experiencing the story. The data come after that. So there are examples of this in our field, and that's why I just wanted to highlight them. Do y'all have others, or did I hit?
I think that's a great one.
Yeah, it's a really good one.
Okay.
I think that is the gold standard.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. So hopefully we'll
So
come back to
everybody do
this. We'll come back to this topic in the future with maybe some data to go with the stories. But I certainly had a lot of fun doing this just as a think piece episode. And we hope you all enjoyed that too. If you'd like to hear some other episodes, perhaps a pairing is in order.
All right, it's time for pairings. So pairings is when I tell you about some other episodes you could go back and catch if you thought this one was interesting. And we have a few that do tie into this episode, I would say. So those include episode 77, where we talk about public speaking. That's where we review one of Pat Fryman's articles. We also talked in episode 111 about behavior analytic language, and that ties in here too. We talked about in episode 222, which was called Grab Bag Triple Deuces, Jackie reviews a Matt Normand article that also talks about behavior analytic language and valence. Episode 1000, which was our very first book club, was when we discussed meaningful differences and what's it called, Jackie? The 30,000 word?
30 million
word. I'm sorry.
30,000 word.
I don't
I
know,
feel like
guys.
we as a society can
can
overcome
do
that
better.
one.
I'm so sorry. And then most recently in episode 274, we talked about ABA and public policy, and we touched on that today too. Also part of pairings, I like to recommend a snack. And so as I referenced earlier, just to, bring you in behind the curtain and tell you a story, we all drove to Portland, Maine.
I did.
Not Jackie.
Not
I didn't
Jackie,
wave.
sorry.
I had
My
a very
whole
busy day
family.
myself as well.
I know you did. We all drove to Portland, Maine today, which is 2 hours away. And then we drove back, which was also 2 hours back. And it was lovely there. We had a great time walking around. And while we were there, we went to the Shipyard Brewery. I have a hard time with that word. Brewery.
It's like the rural jurl.
Yeah, the Roger. And so I thought I'd share with you the delicious meal that I had there. I had a blueberry sour beer, as one should when you're in Maine, and a pesto and olive flatbread. So that's your snack that you get to enjoy.
But it only had to do with your story.
Yeah,
That's
but now
true.
everyone
But now it's
can
everyone's
empathize with me, and I'm sure they're thinking that sounds really delicious.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you, Rob.
And by y'all, I meant y'all. And then by
you.
y'all, I meant the rest of y'all.
Thank you, Rob.
All y'all.
All y'all for listening to ABA Inside Track. Please remember to rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff on any of your favorite podcast players. If you want even more ABA Inside Track content, we'd love it if you also subscribed on our Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where, hey, if you like stories, guess what? We are in the midst
stories
of the summer of book clubs, between episodes from last year that are coming out on the free feed, between all of the episodes we'll be doing that have actual book club components in them this summer. Not all of them are going to be on the free feed. What are you doing if you're not on there at the $10 and up level, getting access to every single book club that comes out? Because not only do you get all the great content, including lots of discussion of stories, including the Pat Fryman's book on sleep, but you get free CEs for listening to those book clubs and our listener choice episodes that we do once a season. We have one coming out pretty soon for the spring on consultation, and then we have another one in the summer. Who knows what it's going to be on? You do, but only if you subscribe at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. You can also email us with your own stories at abainsidetrack@gmail.com or go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all the articles discussed, as well as to find CEs for these articles, or for these episodes. And I'm going to give you the second secret code word that you're going to need, and it's Gatsby, Gatsby, the main character from the book, The Great Gatsby. Is that a rags to riches? Is it a bad to worse? I'm not sure which story that would be. Probably bad to worse. Kind of a sad ending. Gatsby.
Spoilers.
Spoilers for the 100-year-old book. Okay, and we're going to have some final thanks. Certainly, big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye!